Long before the time of the Hearthians, and even before the Knowhere received the signal from the Eye and hastily warped to the Hearthian Solar System, there was another species who heard the Eye and felt compelled to follow its call. We'll call these people the inhabitants. This is their story. Now, of course, this lore video will contain many spoilers for the Echoes of the Eye DLC, so if you haven't played the DLC yet and you intend on playing it yourself, please turn away now. The inhabitants are an unnamed species who originated from a nearby system. They are tall, two-eyed bipedal people, and like the Knowhere and the Hearthians, the inhabitants had a complex social structure, showing love for both their homeworld and their people. They lived on a verdant moon orbiting a ringed planet, and were able to make use of a unique green flame which was capable of transmitting visual information, such as sharing visions between people. This fire does not consume and can therefore burn for hundreds of thousands of years, unless it is extinguished by external forces. While the Knowhere mainly used written records to convey their story, the inhabitants primarily used visual media. But as we learn through the course of the DLC, the inhabitants are revisionists, hiding away crucial pieces of their history that might reflect poorly on them. It takes a lot of investigation on the part of the hatchling, which is the playable character, to uncover the truth. Many eons ago, on their homeworld, the inhabitants received a signal from a mysterious entity which we know to be the Eye. While they did not understand why the Eye had sent the signal, they felt the gravity of the message. They were captivated, and felt called to seek out the Eye at any cost. But unlike the Knowhere, the inhabitants lacked warp capabilities, so the journey would take far longer. They would need to build a self-sufficient spacecraft. To do this, they stripped their pristine homeworld for resources and crafted a massive ring-world spacecraft known only as a stranger to us, within which they could live and seek out the Eye. They left nothing to come home to. Their once fertile lands were now barren. So they departed, in search of the Eye and never intending to return. They made the spacecraft their home, complete with a flowing river and dam, hilly formations, flora and spacious housing. They even decorated their homes with ornate furniture, family portraits, and board games. Never forgetting their mission, they built a temple to honor the Eye. They arrived in the Hearthian Solar System long before the Knowhere, likely even before the Hearthian predecessors. There was no interloper, Brittle Hollow had not started degrading from the Hollow's Lantern's constant bombardment, and Dark Bramble appeared to be a hospitable planet, with no sign of the invasive brambles that would later consume it and trap the Knowhere. This was the inhabitants' new home. But as the inhabitants got within proximity of the Eye, they were able to scan the Eye and interpret its meaning. They saw that observing the Eye would result in the death of their universe, the death of their species. But through their species' demise, new life would form. The extinction of their families and their people for the continuance of the universe beyond their species. In their abhorrence and pain, the inhabitants rejected the Eye, burning down the temple that had, until recently, been used to glorify it. They had given up everything aside from their own families in order to find the Eye, and it had betrayed them. They had been misled. They were drawn to a foreign system to do the will of the Eye at the expense of their own world, and despite their efforts to make the ringed world their home, the black void of space was no replacement for their peaceful night sky and ample flora and fauna of the home world they destroyed. They were eager to take back what was lost. Rather than sacrifice their own world for the sake of the next, they were to persevere beyond the end of the universe. To do that, they needed to ensure that no one else would ever hear the calling of the Eye. So, they devised and deployed a spacecraft capable of casting a field around the Eye, preventing its signal from spreading throughout the universe. The universe was finally quiet. With the Eye silenced, it was time to focus on outliving the end of the universe. Aware of their own mortality, The inhabitants developed a simulation that used their special green flames to link their consciousness to a digital replica of their home world. All the inhabitants needed to do was bear an artifact in the presence of the green flame. Then, when the inhabitant either slept or died, their consciousness would be uploaded to the simulation, and they could live peacefully for eternity, providing the artifact in the real world and its equivalent in the simulation kept burning. The real world and the simulation were connected. Buildings that existed in the real world had their equivalents in the simulation. Extinguishing or igniting candles in the simulation could turn lights off or on in the real world. Extinguishing the artifact in one of the worlds would extinguish its equivalent in the other world, and its bearer would awaken. Or, if the bearer's body had died in the real world, they would simply cease to exist in the simulation, gone forever from both the digital and the mortal worlds. Because the inhabitants were intending to live in the simulation forever, they took several precautions to ensure they wouldn't be interrupted. First, after they silenced the eye, they hid themselves from the world, using a cloaking device to make the stranger invisible from the rest of the world. No radio signals or light sources, aside from the sun, could reveal the stranger from a distance. They were safely hidden away in the middle of a solar system. Second, they created 4 access points to the simulation, which were well hidden to anybody who found the stranger. The first 3 required one to know a secret passageway to a ritual room. The final access point was inside a chamber that had been submerged in the reservoir. Next, they created an alarm system in the simulation which, when activated, would awaken the person who triggered the alarm. Fourth, they destroyed or censored their records from the real world after they had been uploaded to the simulation. Fifth, the intact historical records were hidden behind complex puzzles within the simulation. And sixth, they developed an automatic sun tracker, which would track the sun's state as it turned supernova, enabling the stranger to move further away from the solar system, outside the range of the supernova. Here they could outlast the universe in their simulation. The inhabitants were finally ready. It was time to go home. Together they took their hidden passages, marked by the ringed planet in their homeworld's night sky, into hidden chambers where they gathered around the green flames and gently drifted off to sleep, entering their simulation where they could live peacefully for eternity. While the inhabitants enjoyed their digital homeworld, one, known only as the prisoner, turned against them. The prisoner exited the simulation and deactivated the eye's signal blocker, briefly releasing its signal throughout the universe. The prisoner was quickly apprehended, and the eye's signal blocker was reactivated. The eye would continue calling to the end of time, but it would go unheard. The prisoner suffered a terrible fate. Their people sealed them away in a vault, the keys to which were only accessible from within the simulation. An eternity spent alone, as punishment for attempting to allow the death of the universe and the birth of a new one. In the simulation, the inhabitants' way of life persisted through the ages, as the solar system around them gradually changed. First, the invasive plants consumed and transformed a planet into what we now know as dark bramble. Second, thanks to the efforts of the prisoner, the Knowhere heard and heeded the brief signal that was released. They came to the Hearthian Solar System, oblivious to what the prisoner had done for them, what they had sacrificed. Here, they worked tirelessly to find the exact location of the eye, wondering why it had only called to them once, unaware that the inhabitants had interfered with its signal, and that the prisoner who had released the signal was currently suffering in purgatory, just out of sight. Third, the Interloper arrived in the system, and shortly after its core ruptured, spewing deadly ghost matter throughout the solar system, and wiping out the Knowhere before they found the eye. Finally, a further 280,000 years passed, and the Hearthians evolved, and the hatchling began their journey. All the while, the inhabitants had been living peacefully in their simulation. The inhabitants nearly made it to eternity, but were interrupted on the last day of the universe by two things. First, a pesky little Hearthian with a penchant for exploring every crevice of the solar system in 22-minute loops. And second, failing architecture. Let's begin with the damned dam. Even if the hatchling didn't interfere with the inhabitants' plans by making contact with the Eye, many of them were doomed to die shortly before the supernova. They had planned to use the solar energy from the sun-going supernova to power their ship to move safely beyond the reach of that supernova. However, as the sun is gaining mass, the massive solar panels on the Stranger deploy, and it simply puts too much strain on the dam that is already hundreds of thousands of years old. The dam begins to crack, and then breaks entirely, sending a tide of water throughout the ringed world. Two of the simulation chambers in the lowlands and Cinder Isles are inundated, extinguishing the flames of the inhabitants and permanently erasing them from the world. Only the inhabitants in the hidden gorge and the prisoner sealed in the vault remain untouched. These people would have survived to the end of time, were it not for the hatchling. So, now we get to the hatchling's intrusion of the inhabitants' world. The Hearthians had developed a satellite that orbited the system from relatively far away, having the most distant orbit of any of the planets or objects in the solar system. From a particular angle, the satellite detected a shadow in front of the sun, a distortion caused by the Stranger's cloaking device. This allowed the hatchling to accidentally find the inhabitants' home and investigate their presence in the solar system. Piece by piece, the hatchling investigated the ringed world and learned of the inhabitants' story. But since much of their history had been redacted, the hatchling only had a loose understanding of events. But as always, the hatchling persisted. By viewing the redacted records, the hatchling learned several things. First, the inhabitants had come from a nearby system. Second, they built a spacecraft to come to the solar system in search of the Eye. Third, once they arrived, they learned the purpose of the Eye, and in retaliation, they burned its temple and retreated to their simulation. And fourth, they also sealed something inside of a vault and submerged it. However, the hatchling was unable to determine what or who was inside the vault, nor how to open it. To uncover the remaining secrets, they would need to enter the simulation. The hatchling grabbed an artifact, entered the ritual room where the corpses of the inhabitants lay, and dozed off, entering the simulation. The simulation was not a friendly place for a Hearthian. The inhabitants were intent on keeping out intruders, and would force the hatchling back to the real world, either by extinguishing their flame, or by breaking their neck. Through careful exploration and investigation, the hatchling was able to find the location of the sealed vault. However, to unlock the vault, the hatchling would need to extinguish flames on 3 islands. 2 of the islands lacked a bridge, and the third was guarded by an alarm system, which would wake the hatchling up. The islands were accessible by 3 combination locks, but the hatchling did not have the combinations. The second vital thing the hatchling found was the location of 3 forbidden archives, which contained the intact records of the inhabitants' history. It is here that the hatchling learned that the inhabitants destroyed their home world to harvest materials for their journey. It was also here that the truth about the inhabitants' interference with the Eye's signal was revealed. But even in these forbidden archives, the inhabitants had destroyed the combinations to the sealed vault. Fortunately for the hatchling, there was an alternative path. While the archives lacked the combinations, they contained the secrets of the simulation, revealing 3 glitches that could be used to bypass the locks. First, the simulation uses the artifacts to determine the rendered portions of the world. If the bearer of an artifact simply places it on the ground and walks away, they will enter regions of the map that have not been fully rendered, and here they can see pathways that would remain hidden to one carrying the artifact. Second, the main sections of the simulation are divided by tunnels. To access different sections of the simulation, one must travel through the tunnel on a raft. These tunnels act as loading screens. If the bearer of an artifact disembarks during the loading screen, they will clip through the world and access a usually inaccessible part of the map. The final crucial piece of information about the simulation is that dead people cannot be woken up by the alarm bells. The hatchling must use their knowledge of these 3 glitches to bypass the 3 locks of the sealed vault. First, by abandoning the artifact and stepping outside the range of the rendered world, the hatchling can see the combination necessary to ensure safe passage across the lake. This will remove the first lock. Second, by clipping through the world during a loading screen, the hatchling could gain access to the other side of the lake, bypassing the second lock altogether. To extinguish the final lock in the simulation, the hatchling would need to die within close proximity of the green flames within the real world. This would cause their consciousness to be uploaded to the simulation while rendering them immune to the bells tolling. Dead people can't be woken up by bells. They could safely pass the bridge and extinguish the final lock. Now, with all 3 locks released, the hatchling could finally enter the vault and find out what was inside. Here, the hatchling found 2 relatively empty rooms, with very little to keep one entertained. In the lower chamber resided the prisoner, who greeted the hatchling warmly. Locked away for hundreds of thousands of years by their own people, the prisoner's only ally was a Hearthian who could not even speak their language. But by using a projection tool developed by the inhabitants, the prisoner could reveal to the hatchling what transpired. Here, the hatchling learns the full story, the great risk the prisoner took in releasing the signal, and the hefty price they paid. The prisoner then requested the hatchling share their own journey with them. Here, the hatchling's story is stitched on to the prisoner's history. The prisoner learns that their efforts were not in vain. The Knowhere heard the signal. They had come to the Hearthian system in search of the eye and had paved the way for the hatchling to actually find it. And the hatchling was now ready to complete the task that the Knowhere and the prisoner had hoped would be achieved. The prisoner could finally rest. They released a final screech in delight. And bowed as they left the hatchling. As the hatchling prepared to leave the simulation, they found one final message from the prisoner, a vision of 2 unlikely friends departing together on a raft towards a calm horizon. The prisoner was finally free to pass on. Now, all that was left was for the hatchling to observe the eye. There is one other ending introduced by the DLC, which involves removing the advanced warp core and retreating to the Stranger. The hatchling will be safe from the supernova inside the Stranger, where they'll spend the rest of their life. There'll be no resets and no new universe. But that's not the intended ending, so let's assume that the hatchling does make it to the eye. I've talked in detail about the hatchling's observation of the eye in past videos, so here I'll only focus on what changes at the ancient glade after you've met the prisoner. We know that the eye contains all possibilities for the new universe, and the universe that is observed or formed is dependent on the hatchling's experiences as they draw upon their memories of others. Meeting Solanum in the main game introduces insectoid people in the new universe. Now, the hatchling has the option to also draw upon their memory of the prisoner. The hatchling finds the prisoner and speaks with them, or at least with their memory of them. The prisoner expresses concern about being remembered, worried that their people's weakness and anxiety will negatively shape the new universe. If the hatchling chooses to remember the prisoner, they'll join the Hearthians and Solanum in playing a song, as the new universe is weaved together. Choosing to remember the prisoner results in a second species being present after the birth of the new universe, A tall, looming creature with a familiar coloured flame, watching over the smaller insectoids. Once again, the hatchling's connection to another species has made the next world a richer place. The Echoes of the Eye DLC is ultimately an exploration into two potential responses to learning of the imminent death of one's own universe and the birth of the next. There were those who wished to escape death at any cost and preserve their way of life above all else, even if it means the death of all possibility. And then there were those who were willing to accept their own demise and embrace the unknown. This was a way of infinite possibility. Thank you for watching the video. I've really enjoyed making these lore videos on my all-time favourite game, and I hope you've enjoyed watching them. The other videos in the series can be found on the right hand side of the screen if you'd like to see more. I stream over on Twitch 3 times a week, and a link to my channel can be found in the description below. I'd love to see you there. Once again, thank you for watching.